Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the Society of Product Safety Professionals webinar series. My name is Lauden Harp, and I will be managing the production of this webinar. So I want to go over a few housekeeping rules real quick. First, we're going to have 1 hour for the webinar. It will end promptly at 2 p.m. Central, if not a little bit of time before that. We're also going to have a time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. So if you'll hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat button. And if you'll click on that chat button, you can chat directly to the host, which is me, any of your questions, and those will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will review and respond to all the questions via email after the webinar. Once again, make sure that your mics are muted so you can hear our speaker more clearly. So at this time, I am going to introduce Laurel Roni from Swimways Corporation, who has put the SPSB webinar series together, and will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Lauden. I am so pleased to welcome all of you to the first webinar in the 2018 SPSB webinar series. Our goal for this series is to explore topics relating to the development and maintenance of a comprehensive product safety program. Throughout the series, we plan to cover issues that we, as product safety professionals, all face daily as we work to establish and maintain successful programs that comply with both regulatory requirements and industry-leading practices. We are very excited about this series and would like to thank our exclusive sponsor, Stericycle, for their support in making the series possible. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Tim Cassidy. Tim is the Director of Product Compliance and Safety for Best Buy. He's been in the consumer product safety industry for more than 30 years and is an active member of several working groups in industry associations. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Tim.
Hi, everyone. Tim Cassidy. Loudon, I was going to ask you, there's a black box with some stuff on it on the right-hand side of the screen. I don't know if that's being shared right now or not.
I'm not
100%.
I'll take care of that as you start talking. I see this black box. Yeah, that's a couple of individuals that are present.
Yeah, maybe we could make that disappear. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Cassidy. Thank you for attending today. I wanted to give a little background on the 5 pillars of a well-rounded product safety professional. The SPSP formed a group of experts, and the experts included people from the legal profession, some consultants, some people that have background in industry associations, some manufacturing people, various types of consumer products, and some retailers like myself. And we all got together and described what we felt were the functions of a product safety professional. We had a great long list of things that we felt that we do in this field. And then we winnowed that list down a bit. And then after having completed that, we grouped things into what we called 5 pillars. And we're going to go over those 5 pillars. But you, if you were on the committee, you may have said, you know, gee, we need 4 pillars or we need 6 pillars or something like that. So subjective, but we think we have a good mix of things that the well-rounded product safety professional would have high knowledge of. So these are the pillars. And I want to say that we don't expect that everyone works a great deal in every one of these pillars, but the person who has the right kind of experience to be considered well-rounded in this field is experienced in all of them to some level, and certainly knows what to do when confronted with issues that may come from one or another of these pillar areas. So we're going to go through each one at the same time. This is a survey of the field, and we're not going to go into any great depth on any particular one. There will be a series of webinars coming forth, and there will be people who are experts in various areas of these different functions and talking about them in more depth. So this is to go kind of over the overall field. We're going to go through it: culture, and then assurance, compliance, incidents, and then recalls. And then we will take any questions if there's time permitting And if not, and if there are questions that we can't get to, we will answer them by email. So let's start with corporate culture. So it's very important that we develop the culture at the top of the corporation. It's important that with the CEO and the board of directors, if you're a publicly traded company in particular, understand the importance and gravity of what we do in the product safety and compliance field. We need the tone from the top. And we also need that as professionals in this field, that we are empowered to do the job. And sometimes the job requires making high stakes business decisions, like we need to make a recall, something like that. Or we need to have expensive testing done. So when we go to make those kind of decisions, we need to be trusted to do so. So part of the role is to build that trust and have people understand that we're prudent in the decisions that we make, that we don't recall things that don't need to be recalled on the one hand. On the other hand, we don't hesitate to recommend recall when it's necessary, that sort of thing. So building trust always is important, and having the executive leadership backing us up. Often the middle management gets focused on KPIs that are maybe at odds with the product safety function. So we need the top leaders to ensure that the middle management prioritizes consumer safety as the highest priority always. And then when we go to maybe make some kind of high stakes decision, that we don't have, for example, a salesperson or something that is interfering with our ability to do that because they're concerned that their goals may not be met. So we need to develop that culture and that trust throughout the organization. Part of the culture is being properly resourced. So these are three different areas of resourcing that I'll speak to. First is personnel. We are in a feast or famine kind of business, and so we can't staff for the peak loading, which may occur sporadically. And we need more staff for the sort of average, and considering that we have times where we don't have any really difficult problems to be working on, and other times when we have maybe too many. So we have to have the right balance of personnel, and we also have the ability to go out and maybe get some third-party help when we need it, when the demand is very high. So getting the personnel balance correct is an important part of resourcing question for corporate culture. And we need to have the right tools and equipment. So there's many different kinds of companies that could be involved in a product safety professional role. And for those that are manufacturers, that sort of thing, having the right laboratories and facilities to be able to conduct testing, that's a very important part of the role. Another important part is to have the proper computing tools, databases, and so on. If you're going to be involved in managing incidents, or managing call centers, or managing the supply chain in some way or another relating to product safety, having the right database tools is important. There are all kinds of products out there, but the first place to look is your own tools and see if they don't have the modules available already that may be utilized for this, or the data sources that you need to maybe pull the data that is helpful for the work. We also need to have proper funding. And this is a difficult problem in some cases. For me personally, I find that maintaining reserves is difficult. There are actually accounting rules that making reserves is somewhat problematic in the way that accounting is governed. But having reserves in case that you need to have an incident examination, maybe use a forensic laboratory, or in a worst case scenario, have a recall. Recalls are very expensive, and having reserves is a good idea. If you can't have reserves, to have some idea who and how you will fund these activities should you need the money to do so. And when we look at corporate culture, it's always a good idea to have some idea of failure costs and what they are, and how you can use them to message things. So I have some examples here. Samsung phone example is a fairly recent one that people remember. At the time this was going on, Forbes estimated that the costs were about $5.3 billion to Samsung. That's a huge amount of money. And reputational costs are really a big deal, and we need to make sure that the corporate culture understands that. So in the case of Samsung, they were in a hurry to get their product out before Apple. Apple was about on the verge of coming out with theirs. Then Samsung had this error occur, and then the Apple product came out, and there was some number of people who moved to Apple from Samsung, and that's a huge reputational damage to them. I think Samsung has done a great job of recovering from that, but at the time, in the middle of the crisis, it was a big deal, I can tell you that. And then the diversion of resources is another cost that's hard to estimate, but in the case of Samsung, they built a whole new test facility, deployed 700 researchers, they used 200,000 phones and 30,000 batteries, and they built a new battery advisory council. Plus, they hired Exponent, which is a forensic laboratory, and Underwriters Laboratories and TUV Rhineland for forensic and safety testing services. I can assure you that is not inexpensive. And Samsung's example is not, it's not untypical. I listed some other ones. I really don't mean to have anyone feel disparaged by this in any way. All of these are fine companies. GM had the ignition switch issue. Hoverboards, there's a bunch of different players. Some of them were better than others, but Target with the Easter toys, Takata with the airbags, and there's many, many other examples in the press all the time. And as I say, they're all fine companies, and they work through these issues, but they faced high failure costs, and I think they can attest to what I'm saying. So be able to put yourself in a position of making sure that the corporation understands the cost of failure in the regards of product safety or compliancy matters. So finally, on corporate culture, we need to integrate into our corporate culture, and I think a good question is, where should we fit? Where should we align? In the case of product safety and compliance, there's a lot of places we could fit. So in some companies, we're more aligned to quality or to reliability or to engineering. I could ask that people that are online, please mute if you're not speaking. And so there's a lot of different ways we could fit, but we also could be aligned to the legal department, to the enterprise risk management department, and even in some cases, the marketing department. So there's a lot of different examples that you might cite. And some companies, they will emphasize quality as a marketing function or as a function of their products for marketing purposes. And so you can see an alignment like that. You can see alignments to certainly to various engineering functions, especially if you're in a manufacturing company. But what's the right alignment for your company, and are you in the right alignment? Those are questions that a product safety professional should be looking at and thinking about. We also should consider adding value. One of the things about our field is that no news is good news. And if we're always quiet, people don't think we're doing anything, and they may even wonder why we exist. So there are some ways we can measure the value. Some of them are very tangible: warranty costs, insurance claims, legal litigation matters, and those types of things. And also, when we look at the front end of the process, we have the certification costs and so on. And so well-run programs cut those validation costs by bringing the knowledge necessary to comply to the front of the process and keeping the costs of going through those compliancies as low as possible. There are some intangibles. We preclude government fines, recall costs, injury suits, insurance issues, and so forth. So bringing those types of things, again, into the corporate culture, these are things that we can talk about the cost to other companies, perhaps, that we can aggregate some costs, and we can look at those as opportunity costs that we're saving. And then, as I mentioned before, marketing. Many companies market their safety. You can think of various examples, from automobiles to cosmetics and childcare and toddler products. Those types of things are frequently marketed as safe, and the safety value added is part of what is being marketed. moving from the corporate culture to product assurance, I think as well-rounded professionals, we should contemplate what does it mean for a product to be safe, and what's the difference between safety and compliance, and how do they relate, and what does it mean to be in compliance, and how do we actuate that inside of our organizations. So what I've seen in the last many years is ever expanding consideration of what is safe. And where it used to be primarily focused on acute hazards such as burns or amputations or that type of thing, it's moved more towards things like exposure to chemicals. More recently, a lot of emphasis on cyber safety. And compliance area has evolved to cover things like energy efficiency and radio noise and many other topics. And they seem to fall within the domain of the product safety and compliance team to deal with these things. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is look at what is coming at us and figure out how will we operationalize around them. And we should have some idea of what we mean by safe and what it means to be safe. Some of the definitions that we utilize today are compliance to safety standards. And a question that I have there is that enough? And what if there is no safety standards? And often that's the case. Another thing we can say is, what does it mean to be a standard? And I'll talk more about that later. There's another definition, freedom from harm. I think that's a static definition. It gets bound up in the terms harm and hazard and other risk-related terminology. And if we make things completely free from harm, often then we would not have certain products available to us that people enjoy. You can think of like a motorcycle or something like that. We must take a certain amount of risk. At the end of the day, I like the definition of acceptable risk the most, and it has its limitations as well. So acceptable is nice because it's an elastic term. There was times in society when we accepted much more risk in our lives than today. It has to do with law and politics and societal values, and it's always changing. It's in motion. And then risk is a scientific idea, probability and severity. And this is actually one of the limiters on this definition, acceptable risk, is that oftentimes we're dealing with things that are not technically falling within the idea of probability. They are more dealing with the concept of uncertainty, for which there is no statistical model to follow from. But for most products, especially when we're looking at assuring them, acceptable risk is a pretty good definition. You may have your own definitions, and I would encourage you as a professional to be thinking about, what does safety mean exactly? When we talk about product assurance, there is prevention, of course, and that's a place where we focus much of our efforts. So really need to focus on the design itself. Safety begins with the design, and if the design validates safety requirements as it goes through the iteration of the design process and leads to documentation, it will build a nice, safe product. Then that gives us the basis to understand what is going on in production and what kind of changes might be taking place in procurement and so on, and to make sure that we have the proper controls in place. And that means that we need to have a relationship with quality as a function, because that's really what they do. They look at how are things validated, what is the documentation, and how are the controls applied across the system. So when we look at procurement, we want to make sure that they are in fact buying materials and components that come from the design. They're not buying things based on lower price perhaps, or something like that. We have to recognize there's a lot of pressure on these people to keep costs low, that sort of thing. And with all that pressure on them, sometimes they may want to go out and source something else. It's okay to do that as long as you go through a proper change control procedure. And a good change control procedure will loop in the product safety and compliance people as well as the design team, so that we know that whatever is being asked for from procurement or from manufacturing, that is something that will continue to comply with the design. Other areas of control come down to things like traceability of materials as they are built into the product so that if an incident should occur, we can trace backwards to what did we use, where did we get it from, that kind of thing. Moving on to risk assessment. This is a big field. I think there will likely be webinars on this topic alone, maybe more than one. It's a very significant professional field on its own. There's various tools and techniques that can be used to assess risk of a product. So you've probably heard of some of them: FMEA, fault tree analysis. There's certifications and shipping validations, environmental and other ways of looking at failure risk. There's also use case risk, which is critically important. And depending upon what kind of company you are and what you're involved in, there's many different ways that you can do use case risk assessment. But we can start with simple things like questions: who will use it? What is it? Who is it marketed to? Is it marketed to children, elderly, disabled persons? What does that mean in terms of its operation or use, and how does that affect safety? And then, is it intuitive to use it correctly? That's sort of an ergonomics question, but there are ways to get at that, the intuitive nature of the product and its use. There's a good book on that topic. It's called The Design of Ordinary Things. I highly recommend. It's old, but it is probably the best book on looking at intuitive use of products. There's also the question of, can it be misused? So you think of, in my mind, I think of like a monkey wrench, and I might want to use it as a hammer. Well, if I do that, is it going to shatter and blow up in my face? The product itself almost looks like a hammer, so you could expect someone might use it that way. So that's what we mean by misused. It's whether it's intentional or not, that's another question, and whether you should be responsible for intentional misuse. That's a subject of debate in our field overall. So we should be aware of that, and we should do our best to overcome misuse situations. We need to control production and maintenance of goods, including when we get beyond the sale of product. So processes, we can begin to look at them from a process FMEA point of view. We should, again, work closely with the quality department. If we look at standards like ISO 9000 and the way that it might be audited, we could look at how we might incorporate into that system other safety related ideas like chemicals management standard IECQ 80,000, or the ISO 100377 product safety guidance, which can be easily incorporated within the quality audit system. We might also consider when inspections and tests are necessary and how they relate to the control of safety. And then change controls, particularly for field serviceable items. And when we make changes in the field, you can imagine you bring your car into the shop or something like that, and they have service bulletins that tell them that, they need to change some part for some safety reason, or maybe not even for a safety reason, but something that could lead to a safety problem. And that's one way of tracking these things. So if you have parts that are products that are serviceable, you should probably try and understand what systems you may have to lead to the proper servicing and maintaining of safety as they're being serviced. And finally, we may want to consider, when do we retire a product and what does that mean? So it may be that for safety reasons, we no longer want to allow a product to be serviced. We may tell the consumer they need to buy a new one. It depends on what type of product it is and what the safety related functionality we're speaking of is. Moving on to compliance with laws and standards. One of the key problems I hear in our field is, how do we know what's going on out there? And there is no single source. So there are 3 sources that I use to try and keep current with what's going on. One is legal counsel services. You can use both in-house legal counsel and outside legal services, and some of them have newsletters and so on that you can sign up for. And generally, legal counsels, especially outside counsels, tend to practice in a specific field or area, and those people tend to know what's going on with regulation and rules in their space. Industry associations, and if you're not involved with an industry association, I encourage you to find the ones that relate to your company and your products, and join up with them. Industry associations are generally involved in laws and regulations and rulemakings and so on, and can speak on behalf of your company. They also need your help in what are the challenges to some proposal, and what their voice should be. And then finally, there's certification partners, and again, all the big test houses, the ULs and TUVs and Intertechs of the world, and all the others, and there's many good ones out there. They have newsletters and they have other services that you can avail yourself of that will keep you current on what is going on. There is no single source, as I said, and sometimes we can miss things, but we need to make our best effort to try and keep on top of all the various laws and proposed rules and regulations that are taking place that affect our products in our industry. Also, we need to look at the application of standards. And there's the word standard is, sometimes it's used in different contexts. So in the case of the government, when they say standard, they might be talking about something like 90 parts per million of lead or something like that. That's a standard. But when I think of standards, I'm thinking a little bit more broadly than that. Generally, a standard has, in my mind, two major components. First is that it's generally agreed. And second is that it can be compared against. So you think of, you measure a room and you say it's 10 by 20. 10 by 20, we're taking that to mean feet, and we're taking it to mean that if I take a tape measure and measure 10 by 20, and you take a tape measure and measure 10 by 20, that we're going to have rough agreement on that is a 10 by 20 room, that a foot is a foot, and so forth. That's a standard. But the term standard is being applied in different ways, as I said, and it could be something as simple as a rule that makes a standard. So we have to keep on top of rules and standards, and I think it's important also to be involved in the standards process. I mentioned before service and staying in compliance with standards after sales. And so that means that we have to know if the standards have changed and if that affects anything that we might be servicing. So if we do find that, how do we drive that, and how do we operationalize that? How do we operationalize a new regulation into our manufacturing or our supply chain as we go forward? That's all part of our role to figure that out. So then there's the standards development process. And there are, again, various meanings to the word standard. Voluntary standards, which have a big role in making things safe, is something that I highly encourage people to be involved with. So myself, I'm involved in at least a half a dozen UL standards and technical panels for products that are of interest to my company. But I'm also involved with organizations that represent various industries, such as AHAM, CTA, and others. And these industry organizations also build standards, and participation in standards, writing standards, changes, and so forth is a good use of my time to be sure that the standards are not going to apply rules that are very difficult for us to operationalize or misplace the burden of the standards on the wrong parties in the supply chain, those types of things. And then legislative mandates is something we can help our government affairs people or our industry associations craft smart positions. So we should be aware of what the proposed changes may be and have a voice. We may not want to speak as a company to a government directly, but we may want to work through an industry association, something like that. Some companies may feel that it's in their interest to speak directly. In any case, if we are going to be involved in making sure that standards are fair to our company, we need to be aware of what they are and put ourselves in a position to work with the standards writers, rule makers, and so forth. And industry associations are a great way of voicing your opinions. Moving on to incidents, the first thing we need to have is a monitoring system for incidents. If you don't have one, I encourage you to get one. Figure out a way to hear the voice of the field, what's going on out there. And there's a number of ways that you might hear that through warranties and insurance claims, repairs data, and that kind of thing. call centers, chat centers, and then, you know, product reviews and social media. And there's many other ways you can get, sometimes people send emails to the president of your company, or you get legal notices, or you get some kind of insurance claims that are driving activity, maybe forensic examinations, somebody's house burned down, something like this. And so those sources of data should lead you to a system of escalated issues. So in our case at Best Buy, we use a number of keywords, and if someone says cut, burn, fire, shock, whatever, that will create an incident case, and then those incident cases are reviewed and escalated, and then that escalation leads us to take various actions. So some of the actions might involve the government, or might involve quality improvements, or a variety of other things, which I'll talk about more here in a moment. So acting on that data, we need to determine, is this serious or not? So we need some way of escalating. And one of the things we can do is ask consumers for photos. These days, very easy to get photos emailed, and then we can look at those in a picture is truly worth 1,000 words. When we have doubt, we escalate. That's the first thing. Escalate it and get your more senior professional people looking at it and seeing what you need to do. Another question is, was there medical attention sought or needed? That should be an alarm if someone said they had to go to an emergency room. And was there any serious property damage? So if something caught on fire, or there was some other kind of serious property damage, that might also be a reason that an incident should be escalated more highly. If an incident is escalated, then, you know, we need to decide some things about it. Do we want to get a product back from the field and so forth, and determine whether or not it's a design or manufacturing flaw? Is it reportable to the government? And do we need, you know, some deeper examination of the product? So government reporting is a potential outcome. And one of the first questions we need to know is, what government are we reporting to? So if your products are sold all over the world, you could be reporting to many governments. You could be reporting to a specific government if it's a product sold in a given country or region, or sold in a market block, say the EU or North America, something like that. So what governments are you reporting to? And then for each of those, do we know what forms we need to use? And by forms, I mean, you know, the forms you fill out. Like each one has their own way that they want you to communicate incidents to them. And then, you know, do we need to involve outside legal counsel? So I would say this: if you're looking at a form and you don't think you fully understand the terminology, or if you don't know what a given government's threshold for reporting is, or something like that, it's very wise idea to talk to legal experts who can answer those questions, and not presume that you understand the law yourself, unless, of course, you are a lawyer and you are an expert in this area. So sometimes incidents will lead us to the use of forensic tools. And again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I always start with that, and what the story of the consumer is. And then from there, we may say, this looks like a pretty serious issue. And then we want to determine how we may investigate that. We may need investigation support from an insurance adjuster out in the field, or we may want to recover a unit. And then finally, we may want to go to a forensics laboratory. Forensics laboratories are expensive. So we use that as a means judiciously. If we can use a manufacturer's laboratory, and we believe that they won't be overly biased in their result, but generally they are well equipped and they have experts who know what they're looking at. But when we feel we might be in a litigation matter, or we might be faced with a governmental recall or something like that, we may want to use a third-party forensics laboratory. And those laboratories generally have experts who are more in the PhD level, and they bring a lot of scientific tools to bear. And they can give you a very different perspective on what root cause is and how to deal with it. So I do suggest, if you feel the need that you go out and you get a forensic laboratories. Again, it goes back to that earlier part. We need to have the trust of our corporation that if we say, you know what, we need that expense to be made, that they're going to say, okay, if it's coming from you guys, and we know it's the right thing to do. Moving on to recalls and withdrawals. There's a difference between a withdrawal and a recall in the way that I use the language. A withdrawal is a private affair, and what we're trying to do is prevent sales of the product. So generally, it means that we've found a problem, maybe a quality issue, maybe marginally a safety issue, something like that, or we have just introduced the product and we're catching it early. So we just want to preclude the public from getting their hands on the product so that they're able to then, we're able to get those back, and then we don't have to do a recall. On the other hand, it may be something that we're discovering that's in the field, there's plenty of them out there, and now we feel that it's essential that we recall the product. Now that's a public affair. We need to work with the government, and there's many steps involved, and so we're going to go into that a little bit. So the term corrective action, if you're in the quality department, might take on a different connotation than if you're working with the government. So the government means a specific thing by corrective action, and that is how we will entice the customer to give us the product back or allow us to repair it, because what we're looking for is to get 100% of the product if possible. A lot of factors involved in what will lead to a really good quality of recall from the standpoint of a number of units that we are able to affect. But we want to do our best to get as many as we can. So generally, we have a monetary exchange, but we could also be doing a repair. And corrective actions need to consider also fraud prevention. If people are going to get money, they come up with many clever ways to get that money from you. So you should consider that in your corrective action planning. And corrective action should consider how the products can be prevented from re-entry into commerce. Again, people are, they're clever about how they make money, and things can make their way to sites like eBay or Craigslist or something like that. And you should be aware of that and taking that into consideration if you're trying to effect a recall. Recall planning, we need to consider how will we notify consumers, what languages will we need to speak to them in, what we will do to identify the proper product. Many times people will hear brand X is having a recall and they have a brand X product. So they will contact you. I have brand X product, and you will need to figure out that it's really not the subject of the recall. It's a different product entirely. And how will you work through that process? So that sort of thing all has to be built into your plan. Where will the product go? How will you track who sent them? Quarantining the products and fraud mitigation are all things that you need to be concerned with in the return logistics process. I have a case I can think of where we recalled a product, and immediately upon return, we had it spray painted so that it couldn't re-enter by somebody maybe nefariously grabbing a product and then returning it. So I spent a lot of time on the fraud mitigation, I know, but it's overlooked and it's very important. So that's why I bring it forward as much as I do. Also, the disposition of recalled units is very important. Sometimes the government will want to witness if you're going to destroy units. You have to determine whether they're going to be repaired, maybe for refurbishment, for re-entry into the marketplace, or whether the repair is going to be in people's homes, and how will you be able to be assured that that repair was made and that it was made correctly. And if we're going to be recycling products, again, we have to be concerned about the fraud part, where if you hand it off to a third party to recycle, that we've taken effort that recycler can't turn around and sell those units in some way, unintentionally as it may be. And then data and reporting, we want to get the right statistics and data for the government reporting, and governments do expect reporting. So again, your plan should have how will we capture the data? Is the data captured at the return logistics center? Is it captured at the call center? Who's capturing it? Is that your team's responsibility, or is your team getting a report? How are you guaranteeing the accuracy of the data that you're getting? How are you aggregating that data into reports for governments and that sort of thing? So then we have the execution of the recall. Again, are we going to use call centers? Are we going to use chat centers? Are we going to reach out through some kind of social media messaging? What are we going to do? And how are we guaranteeing that the consumer's understanding the correct product, that we're working on the right things? And then making it very clear where we're going to bring the product, what we're going to do with the product, how that's going to be managed. I've talked enough about fraud mitigation already. And then the reporting aspects, again, how will we gather the data, who's going to gather the data, and all that sort of thing should have been well worked out in a plan. And then once you're in the midst of it, you'll probably discover the things that you failed to plan for, and then should have a plan for recovering your plan. So that's the opening salvo on what this field is about. And if there's time, I can take a few questions. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. We do have a couple of questions for you. Let me see where the first one is. So the first question is, how can we keep track of what is happening at the Cpsc?
Yes, okay. So again, there's a number of ways. One way is to visit their website frequently and sign up for RSS feeds and that sort of thing. So they will speak to you directly through their web tools. That's one way. Another way is to keep in close contact with your industry associations. And another way is to look at legal help from various outside legal counsels or inside legal counsels that may have the ability to track information through legal publications and that sort of thing. So the Cpsc is required to post things in the Federal Register, and I would not advise trying to read the Federal Register or something. It's going to talk about everything from soup to nuts. But if the Federal Register is being altered by the Cpsc, then generally people in industry associations, law firms, and third-party organizations like certification houses become aware of those things, and those are good sources of information.
Wonderful, wonderful. Here's another question. Do you have any recommendation for database tools?
Well, that's a difficult one. There's a number of good services out there. It depends on what your what the scope of what you're trying to do is. So I don't want to name any specific.
For compliance test reports, I just got that in. They said for compliance test reports. For compliance
test reports. Okay, so there I would work with the big third-party test houses, and I would look to them to provide test reports. Now, if you don't want to work with one of those third parties or whatever, I don't know how many on the call understand what a technical file is and how a safety standard is essentially turned into a checklist, and then you drive the product through the checklist. So there are ways of validating the product to, say, safety standards without going to third parties by creating your own checklist and so on. So you can do that in, basically in Excel. I think the issue with the homegrown tools is you need to store them in ways that they're retrievable. You need them for posterity. You may need to pull them forward in the case of some kind of litigation to show that you did due diligence. But in general, I recommend third-party test houses who will generate test reports for everything that they do. They can test whatever it is that you need done, whether it be chemical testing or product safety certification testing or testing to other regulatory schemes. So not all of the regulatory items require any third party. Things like, energy efficiency as an example. There's DOE may require that you run testing. It doesn't require that you use a third party. So you might have to go to their database and fill some things out, stuff like that. So if you're making records for the government, then you may want to make a copy of that record. But the government itself would be your record source. So there's a number of ways. It depends upon specifically what it is that you're assessing and validating. And if there are, more specific questions on that, if you send me examples, I can try to give you some ideas by email.
Great, great. Here's another question. Are there any resources that we can use to help find service providers, such as attorneys, test labs, consultants, etc.?
I think the SPSP might be a resource for that. We do know of various consultants as an organization, and there are quite a few out there. As far as the test houses go, there are many big name companies out there. They're all quite good. I don't favor one over another, but what I do think about is what they can do to help me beyond the scope of validating products, for example. So I work closely with Underwriters Laboratories and TUV Rhineland and SGS, those three companies in particular. And as a result of my working with them, I'm updated on standards. I'm involved in issues that come up. They keep me abreast of things, and they do this free of charge. They also offer some training services, often at a discounted rate or even free, based on the volume of work that we do with them. So you might consider, if I engage in a volume of work with an activity with one of those houses, is it going to be sufficient that they would be enticed to give me other services, and who would be best placed to give me those services? Those factors that you might want to consider as you look at choosing a third-party test house.
Okay, great. I had a question real quick. Someone asked if you would be able to give out your email contact information so that they can, because for reference, I guess maybe they were wanting to contact you about a specific question or something like that. They said they weren't sure if it would be sent out later to all the attendees. I wasn't sure if you wanted to give out your email or not.
Yeah, sure. You can contact me at timothy.cassidy@bestbuy.com. I also have a LinkedIn page. You should feel free to look me up there as well. And I will be happy to answer any questions that I can. If I don't have good answers for you, I'll just simply tell you I am not knowledgeable in that area. And maybe if I know someone who is, I might point you in a direction. But I will do my best to give you some guidance.
Perfect. I've got another question for you. Is the likelihood of high penalties reduced under a pro-business administration, such as we have at this time?
I can't say that definitively that it is, but I think the likelihood of I guess being scrutinized in such a way that you could wind up being fined might be reduced somewhat. Let's say that the government, and I presume we're talking about the U.S. government. The U.S. government, under the auspices of Cpsc, was highly controversial in their approach to fines in the past administration. I don't know how much that has changed. I know that the attitude towards it is different with the new administration, but there's been an awful lot of change there. For a while, we only had one person representing the new administration even on the commission, and so it remained in the control of the previous administration's commissioners. It's just now reached a 2-to-2 balance, and there is a third person that is nominated. I don't know where that stands. And then the acting Commissioner Burkle has not been made the commissioner yet. So I mean the chairman yet. So a lot of things pending on the Senate, and a lot of open issues there to be definitive about what that means for fines and likelihood of fines and all that. But I do see a shift in the attitude of the organization. I am hopeful that we will be engaging a CPSC that is more collaborative. I want to work on solving safety issues rather than, after the fact fighting about whether there was deliberacy or something like that. So it's better to try and prevent problems than it is to, get beat up after they've occurred. So that's my thoughts.
Great. Here, I think I've got 2 more questions for you. So this one is, if I want to get involved in an ASTM or UL type standards committee, who would I contact to learn specifically what I need to do?
Okay, if you work with UL, you can contact your person there. Otherwise, if you send me an email, I will find somebody at UL to answer your question. They have a different group running the standards than they do running the certifications part. Certifications at UL has become a for-profit business, and standards remains a not-for-profit business as it's in the public interest. But they all, of course, talk to each other, and I can get you in touch with someone there. As far as ASTM goes, I would go directly to their website and see. They have a variety of different committees, so it depends on the product type. They have a lot of different types of standards and a lot of different types of products, and that's just 2 of the many standards organizations that you might consider. Then, as I mentioned, I know different standards coming out of industry associations. Again, AHAM, who's an appliance organization, they do standards, and Consumer Technology Association, they do standards, and there are probably many others. So I would advise that if you have an industry association, you talk to them about their involvement in standards and see what they may be more directly involved in things that affect your products. But as far as ASTM goes, I would say look at their website.
Great. We got 1 more question. So what role, if any, does the Cpsc play in a product withdrawal?
None. That's the point of withdrawal. It is a private concept. So what I would say is this: if your product is in retail channels, that you work with your retailer to make sure that you stop the sales of the product as quickly as possible if you want to do withdrawal. If a withdrawal is based on a quality defect and you don't believe that it is an imminent safety failure, then a withdrawal might make sense for you. If you believe that there's sufficient number already in consumers' hands and that it is definitely going to lead to a safety failure, then do a recall and don't hesitate. Just get it moving. The faster you do it, the more units you will get back through the recall, the more effective your recall will be. The longer you delay, the harder it is to get things back, and the more diverse the channels become that you have to maybe chase down. So people buy things, they sometimes give them away, they sell them, they have garage sales, all kinds of things can happen. So the sooner you act, the better if you're going to do a recall or a withdrawal. And so I think we're going to take that action, getting there quickly and taking that decision and making it happen. That's really the primary thing.
Perfect. Well, Tim, once again, I want to thank you. And thank you everyone that joined us today. The webinar recording will be available on our website by the end of this week. And for those of you who have submitted questions, we addressed all the questions here. So it was wonderful. In addition, please watch for announcements about the upcoming webinars in our Cpsc series. Thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful day. That concludes our webinar today.